Hey guys, welcome back to another video for the Concept Design Club. This is going to be the third and last video of these one-on-one interviews with concept artists. Today we have Thabiso Mhlaba, a concept artist based in Chicago, Illinois. And he's been so grateful and kind to share his knowledge about the concept art industry, answer some of your questions, and really give you guys a ton of knowledge about what you need to know if you're trying to pursue concept art. So, Thabiso, thank you for making it today.
Not at all, no problems. Always good to talk to people and give them whatever I've learned. It certainly makes it a lot easier coming up.
Yeah, a lot of people can really benefit from this, and it's not going to be anything too like serious or formal, just a regular Q&A.
Sounds good.
Okay, so to start things off, can you please possibly explain to people your origins and basically who you are, what you do, and what you worked for in the past?
Sure. Let's see, where do I start? Basically, where I'm at currently is I'm at Scientific Games, which is a slot machine company in Chicago. I also do freelance illustration, and concept design, and that sort of stuff. I've worked for a couple different companies. More recent stuff that people will probably see is some Roll20 stuff, although that's not yet announced. It's soon, though. But basically, moved to the U.S. when I was about 10 years old and fell in love with concept art sort of randomly after playing a few of the Final Fantasy games and seeing the art. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. And sort of dove into learning what it takes to make all the different characters and creatures that appear in games. And that sort of led me into pursuing art in college. And then eventually, once I graduated, just the first job I got was over at Scientific Games. Obviously with some downtime in between where I worked at Warsaw Blumenthal or their Turbo Dog Studios doing advertising and things like that. But yeah, basically where I'm at now is working on games.
Oh, cool. So you said, going off of that, you're pretty recently out of college, right?
Yeah, 2014. So recently is it feels recent to me because I'm still pretty much at my first full professional gig. But yeah. Yeah,
that one thing that really was interesting about reaching out to you, because you're still pretty fresh to growing in the concept art world, and you're only 4 years out of college, which is very much relatable, a lot more relatable to a lot of students. Not only students, but people who have also recently graduated. You're like one step up from where they currently are. So it'll be really interesting to get like your insight and to get some answers from you about where you
absolutely
are. Okay, and so you said you work at Scientific Games, right? How exactly did you get that job?
So getting to Scientific Games is actually a really interesting scenario. At that point, I was pretty much only applying to internships where I could find them, because the way the job kind of worked out was I was in my last semester at University of Michigan, and kind of didn't really have a plan for what I was going to be doing next. I just knew whatever job I got, I wanted it to be somehow related to games and making art. And basically, as I was approaching graduation, a friend of mine, an online friend of mine, who was currently working at Scientific Games, basically saw that I was graduating and they had an opening and just hit me up and said, hey man, you looking for a job? Because we're hiring. I think you're good enough to do it. And said yes, and sure enough, in the span of like 2 weeks after graduation, I was moving to Chicago and starting the new job.
And so that's a lot easier than like the typical grind really hard on your portfolio and apply and go through a trillion rejections.
Yeah, kind of. I think there's one of the things that I figured throughout that whole process was the level of work I was trying to get with all my other applications was beyond what my actual skill level at the time was. And so when I applied to, it was called WMS Gaming at the time. It's now Scientific Games. But my art level was a lot closer to what they needed for, sort of all the games they're working on. And so I had a portfolio that had been made mostly within that year. And when you know, my current lead and a few others saw the portfolio, they were like, oh, this guy's really good. He can probably do all the stuff we need him to do. And that's what sort of allowed me to get in, because even with the recommendation, the main thing is the work good enough? Is the portfolio good enough? And because of that, you know, once I had the job and I was working, sort of doing all the day-to-day stuff, I started looking at portfolios of people who had gotten in at the places I had been trying to apply, you know, the Riot Games, Rockstar, Blizzard, so on and so forth, and realizing that, oh, okay, actually my work was nowhere near good enough to try and get those jobs. And me sort of, you know, the idea of sort of grinding and trying to get you know, my portfolio instantly good enough to get in there would have been kind of a waste of time on my end, just because you're not going to become amazing overnight. You know, I was still relatively new to even trying to make concept art when I was graduating. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting insight, especially considering that's the path a lot of students who typically graduate outside of college take. They usually go straight into the studios like Riot or Blizzard if they want to work in games, or Disney, or so on and so forth, not really realizing that the bar for those jobs are insanely high, and those are literally the top studios in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think people should be aware that there are a lot of game studios that are, you know, smaller game studios that are working on indie projects. You know, you can go on the sites like IndieDB and whatnot, where people are doing projects on the side and whatnot. Those are hit and miss, because like any project where nobody's getting paid and it's just kind of a passion project, they're prone to fall apart pretty quickly because people don't know too much what it takes to actually to make a game. But I think it's important that people look at applying to jobs as less of a measure of your credentials and more of a measure of your skill, because really that's the only thing that's going to get you the job, is whether or not you're good enough to have it. I'm sure on occasion someone will luck out somewhere every now and then where they get a job that might be beyond them, but really when you're applying, if you don't think your work is as good as the people who are already there, then you should, you know, take a step back and try and evaluate.
Awesome. Like I'm actually really glad you said that, because that's one thing I do advise that people do, and that's one thing I was planning on for myself, like actually applying to smaller studios and then working your way up. So I'm glad to hear like someone else can actually validate that and say it's a really good idea choice for starting out in your career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's especially because I think the way the industry works now is a bit different than when a lot of the, a lot of the people who we tend to look up to started. You know, the sort of the landscape of hiring was very different for them, where, you know, you'll hear stories from people where they're like, I was somebody's cousin and I was delivering coffee and they said, hey, you can draw, right? And, you know, it's just some sort of roundabout way that they ended up working. And it's literally because there was just nobody, there wasn't that much demand. Whereas now there is a ton of demand for those jobs. And so you gotta be among the best if you want to get up there with the AAA companies.
That's true, especially like the higher end AAAs.
Yeah, absolutely.
One question about while you were in college, did you ever get the feeling as you were applying to the jobs before you got into scientific games? Did you ever feel like it was very hard and like you would like never make it? Like that existential dread that I'm pretty sure every college student feels, especially near graduation time. Did you ever get that feeling, and did you ever combat it? If so?
Yeah. I think just about everyone. I think you should get that feeling if you're being sort of realistic about your outlook on getting a job and working especially as a concept artist, because it's not an easy industry. I think part of the problem, I think a big part of where that dread kind of comes from is people kind of look at it the same way as they do other industries, where there's like a really there's like a really defined pipeline that starts from like, okay, well, your junior year in college, you get an internship at whatever company. If that goes well, then probably by the time you graduate, they hire you on as an associate, and then you sort of work your way up over 3, 4, or 5 years or whatever. And it feels a lot more like other industries are designed to sort of teach you the thing and bring you up to your ultimate sort of position that you're looking for straight out of college. Whereas concept art really is just, once you graduate, you're competing with the big boys. Like there are very few jobs where they're just going to be holding your hand and teaching you how to do it. Or at the very least, the kinds of jobs where they're doing that they're just at a premium. There are very, very few places where you'll find those kind of jobs easily. And so your best bet is just to get as good as you can as quickly as you can.
Right. Especially like using the time you have in college very wisely, because a lot of us don't really like to think of it this way, but these years we're still pretty sheltered, and we haven't hit the tough realities of life where, we have to move back home and start paying rent and bills and everything. And so while we have like the comfort of being in college, we really need to use that opportunity and time to get as good as we can, so that we can get to the studios.
No, absolutely. And I kind of go back and forth on this because I've seen all kinds of advice from different people on how you spend your time in college, especially if you're at a school where maybe you don't feel like you're getting exactly the education that you need to prepare you for the industry, because there are not that many schools that are going to teach you all the stuff you need for concept art. So there is a degree of self-determination there where you sort of have to figure out a bit earlier than most other people would that, hey, this is what I'm going for, and how am I going to get there if I, what is it that I need to get there, and how much of that am I getting now, and what do I need to do to get the rest of it? And that's hard to do. That's tough. For some people they just have that kind of personality where they figure that out really early on and sort of work through it. Others, it kind of has to happen in the way that you sort of get out and then reality hits you and you're like, all right, I need to get my stuff together. And I had a bit of that before actually graduating, which is why I think it was a little easier for me after graduation, just because during my time at school, just with the cost of education and all that sort of stuff, I was working, and so I had to kind of figure out like, okay, well, this job that I have right now is absolutely not what I want to be doing, and cost of living, everything's so expensive. You have to really manage your time well and know what you're doing. And so I kind of got that fire lit under me before graduating, and it allowed me to sort of redirect myself in a good way.
Nice. Like, how soon before graduation did you get the fire?
Oh, this was like maybe the end of my sophomore year.
Oh, okay.
So yeah. So I overall I spent 6 years in college, because sort of midway through there was financial trouble and whatnot, and a whole bunch of family and personal stuff going on, and so I had to spread out some of the time that I was in some of my credits, and sort of work during that time as well. And there was a point in the middle there of kind of hitting the bottom where I was just like, oh, this sucks. Mm-hmm. and it just made me take stock, and I was like, you know what, I really, really want to do this. I think it's hard to know what you want to do for the rest of your life, especially at that age, but I felt like, yeah, this is exactly the thing that I want to do, and sort of making that decision then and there and defining it is what pushed me beyond, I think.
Awesome. That's really, really, really cool. Like, that's the thing you always need. You have to have that inner want and that inner drive in order to do it. And they always say you get the change to really turn things around once you've kind of hit that lowest point.
Yeah. I think there's a way to look at, I don't know, succeeding in this industry in particular, I think, where there are people who you'll see that it kind of seems like things just sort of worked out for them. Like things just kind of worked out really nicely. They didn't have to work too hard to get to where they were. Either they had some insane amount of talent to begin with, and so like they didn't have to do that much more to get to where they needed to get. And then there are the people who it's just like, man, they struggled through every bit to get to where they are now, and so on and so forth. And I think the healthiest way to kind of look at it is to not assume which one of those people you are and just work as hard as you can. Because, it's like the conversation between talent and skill, talent and hard work, where it's like, yeah, some people just make it off of talent in quotation marks, and some have to work really hard to get to a certain level of proficiency. And the thing is, it's a lot more dangerous for people with a natural aptitude because they're prone to laziness because they don't have to. Working hard is a skill, and if you're always used to being good at something, the first time you hit a significant wall, you might fall apart just because you don't know what it's like to actually push through that. So I say to people, just push, always push, because being able to push is your most important skill. That's what actually matters.
So very true. And that brings me to my next question about your actual job at Scientific Games.
Yeah.
What is an actual day in the life of working for that studio? Since you say you work at a studio that makes casino games, correct?
Yeah, we make slot machines. Well, we make a lot of things. Web games, slot machines, some mobile games. We also do lottery. Just the whole gambling suite is kind of what the company sells. And so my specific job is as just a staff artist is basically I make everything from the animations, the symbols, the actual assets that go in the games, to promotional and marketing materials, to basically anything that has art in it, I will at some point be involved with. Wow. And so depending on the project, that involves different things. So let's see, what's the recent? So the most recent project I finished was a James Bond game, actually. And it was based on the movie Thunderball. And so because we're working with an established IP and there's certain sensibilities about, how to present different stuff, most of the work in that was actually not actually painting anything up, although there was a little bit of that. It was a lot of photo retouch, but then a lot of graphic design and animation work where we're trying to figure out how to present all the different features of the game and the different bonuses and all that sort of stuff. So, it's a lot of time in Illustrator and After Effects. There was actually a good amount of 3D, so working with that in Unity. It's really a very generalist kind of job where, yes, people will have their sort of strong points where it's like some of what you do will be, your animation. Like we have a bunch of guys who worked at StarToons and some at Disney, like people who worked in sort of the early 90s animated TV realm. And so they're super skilled at that sort of stuff. Then we have people who are more your traditional illustrators. Then we have some strong 3D artists, but everyone kind of learns a general set of skills. Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
And with that job, since it's not exactly like a full-fledged concept art job, you haven't felt like you, of course not made it, right? Considering even the tools and the type of work that you do at work varies differently than the stuff you show on your art station.
Yeah, it's kind of an in-between kind of thing where there are projects. It's sort of project by project how much of it actually relates to what I think my core skills are. So my very first project when I got there was like an Asian themed game, but all of the art in the game was original art. It had to be generated by me, so I had to do a lot of actual concepting of okay, what are the backgrounds going to look like? So I was actually drawing up environments and characters and stuff like that. It's just the ultimate form of those characters and environments wasn't going to be like a character that you run around and shoot things with. It was a symbol or an animation that plays out, or that sort of thing.
Wow.
Yeah, but yeah, as far as made it, that's something that I think is a it's an elusive term. I don't know. I feel like I've sort of landed on my feet and gotten my bearings, and I kind of know where I want to go, sort of further on in my career, and things are starting to turn in that direction somewhat. But yeah, I still think that very much that this is sort of the first step of where I want to be.
Awesome. And working at like a small independent studio, even because it's not like some big AAA studio, like I know NetherRealm is near you guys because
here's actually something that I'll say to that is that it's actually not a small studio. I think there's and people who know the slot industry will catch this right away, is that it's actually a huge industry. Like there are tons, like the amounts of money that these companies are making are, you know, in the billions of dollars.
No way.
Yeah, and so even my studio that I've been working at, I mean, they recently downsized, but at our Chicago campus, because there's like 7 campuses, I think it was 600 plus people in the building. So, you know, for a single building, you know, 600 people, and then that's just one of the campuses, and you know, we have multiple campuses across the U.S. and then several in other countries. It's very much a large sort of corporate environment. It's not really a small studio the way you might expect from other gaming studios.
Man, I never would have thought of that. That's interesting.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's the one thing that's interesting, and that's kind of what my experience was starting out, was when I got the call from the friend, and he was like, "Hey man, you want to come in?" And I took a look at sort of what they did, and I was like, "Oh, you know, yeah, this is just some sort of side thing that people do or whatever." But then I actually got there and got to their building and started learning more about the industry as a whole. I was like, wow, this is huge. Like their budgets are bigger than most gaming companies, and the amount of money that they put into development, and even the number of games that they put out per year is, you know, we probably put out in our studio alone something like 10 games a year, 10 plus games a year.
Wow.
And then there's hardware also that we put out, and it's actually a lot that goes into it. Yeah.
That's crazy. And it's also crazy to think that like one of those games, you said like every asset in there is your art. Like,
yeah.
How does that feel?
I mean, it's cool. It's the kind of thing where I'm just like, oh, I guess this is literally just my game. Like I put all the stuff in it. It was literally me, a designer, and one engineer, or 2 engineers. But because the structure of the games doesn't change, it doesn't vary that drastically. It's a lot easier to just have one artist to get on a game and sort of make all the art for it. Because that game was my sort of, hey, learn how slots work game. It was basically them teaching me how the games work, and sort of what the hallmarks of their design senses are and all that sort of stuff.
Very interesting. And you also said you do some freelance work on the side. Can you possibly talk about that?
Yeah. So freelance work that I've done on the side is a lot of. The most recent was actually for an educational game with a friend of mine, basically developing a tool for classrooms that will gamify learning, and financial learning, I think, was the main thing they were starting with, where it's like supposed to go out to schools and teach kids how to manage their money and so on and so forth in anticipation of college and stuff like that. But this was a mobile game, and essentially most of the work was a mix between doing, again, sort of illustration for you know, character avatars and assets and environments in the game, and then a little bit of graphic design with how that stuff is is presented over across multiple sort of platforms because it's on their mobile devices, but also on the internet on your computers and some other stuff with the smart boards, I think they're called. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that was a lot more light work. That's kind of stylized, cartoony, sort of geared towards kids. Some other stuff recently is, like I was saying, for Roll20, I was doing some. This was probably more in my wheelhouse in general. Was some character icon packs, token packs, where basically I was doing artwork, designing a bunch of different avatars that fitting within the fantasy realm, obviously, since it's on Roll20. So it's Dungeons and Dragons style fantasy characters, but all of people of color, more or less. So trying to add a bit of variety to sort of the stuff that's available for other gamers, things like that.
Really cool, and I must say, much needed too.
Yeah. Beyond that, I did do for a period of time storyboarding for Advertisement, which is interesting. Which is one of those gigs that I think it pays pretty well, but it's pretty intense work because a lot of times your hours are pretty rough, and they kind of own you for the period of time you're signed up for. Definitely remember one gig where I think they had me for 72 hours roughly, but it was literally 72 hours almost. I actually slept in their office, and I was just there, just working the whole time.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but the check was nice, so.
Hopefully for 72 hours of nonstop work.
Oh yeah. And it's a lot of turnaround, a lot of just like, hey, we got this person for like 3 days, so we need to get as many ideas out as quickly as possible and then settle on them and then have a sort of defined plan to actually push to the proposal by by whatever date.
That's pretty cool. How did you go about getting those freelance jobs?
So the storyboarding job in particular, there was another friend who had worked with them before, but was moving to another city. This was back in New York, but he was moving to another city and basically said, they're always looking for good artists, and if you are sort of above a certain skill level, they'll sort of bring you on, and it's basically an ad agency, but they have artists on retainer to kind of contract out for different projects. And so essentially what it was they would get a new project, they'd see who's available and whose skill set it fits the most, and then give you a call and see if you're available. And then basically you work for whoever is hiring them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they did reach out to you?
Well, so I gave my portfolio in first, and then when the work came around, that's when they would call me to be like, hey, we've got a thing if you want.
Got it. Cool.
Yeah, it's kind of like an agency, pretty much.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Going off of that, actually, so we covered freelance work and studio job, but what about, do you have any experience doing internships?
No, actually, that was the one thing that I never made it to. And it's funny because that was all I was applying for when I was sort of nearing the end of my time in college. Basically, I saw all the different. I know the EA has one of the bigger internship programs, and I reached a point where I think I had been applying for internships because I was scared that I'm probably not good enough yet. Let me try and get an internship because at least then I can learn some stuff. Yeah, I won't be getting paid, but that looks really good on a resume. Mm-hmm. And I got to a point where I kind of looked around at some of the other artists I knew, and I was like, no one else seems to really be going for the internship thing. It seems to be a really the return on investment there may not be as good as it appears to me as a student. But I essentially was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna try and get an actual an actual in-house job first. And, gonna skip the internship.
Right. Like that's something interesting I heard on a podcast recently. It was these two guys, and they were talking about the art industry and giving advice to college students, and they actually said there are a lot more like junior level in-house studio positions than there are actual internships.
Yeah. I absolutely believe that. I think even at my studio, I only have ever known of one intern.
Wow.
I don't know that we've ever had any other interns. Otherwise, they're always junior artist positions that open up every now and then. So yeah, I wouldn't say don't apply for that, but if if you think you're good enough to really be working there, just apply for a junior position because that's also just better for you. I don't know that an internship somewhere is going to be super helpful in your resume as opposed to just actual experience.
Right. That plus it goes off of what we were talking about before, where a lot of the studios that have internships are typically the higher studios. Like I know Blizzard's internship and Disney's internship opens up every year, and of course people apply to them thinking, oh, it's an internship, but they forget it's Blizzard and Disney, the two top studios in the world. And so the rate of like rejection must be within the trillions.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there are like hundreds of thousands of applications like every year, because it's not just people in the U.S. It's also people abroad. So it's going to be a tough one there.
Right.
I think also the other thing is if you're not at a feeder school, because I think one of the things that happens with internships is that interns tend to be picked up from schools that are actually local to wherever that studio is, whatever that campus is. They usually pick up students from a school nearby because they will have a relationship, or they're specific schools that a lot of people will come from. So I know in my studio, a lot of people who end up working here went to Full Sail. And so it's like, oh, yeah, there's just like a weird number of people coming from Full Sail. And it's like, well, because there was, however many years ago, there was a round of people who all went to Full Sail. And then as the company was growing and they were looking for people to come in at various positions, a whole bunch of the recommendations were all people from Full Sail. And so when it's time to start sort of looking for more people or trying to do outreach to see, if there's a program somewhere that's teaching the stuff we would need, it's all Full Sail alums who are like, hey, you know what, let me go back to Full Sail because I know whoever director of student something and this professor, and you go give a talk, and then that they sort of feed back and forth between each other.
Wow, makes total sense too, and it'll be like a lot easier on the it's a lot easier on the studios. Just go with what they know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it's just like, all right, rather than sort of picking somebody up from wherever and not really knowing what their actual competence is, it's nice to have a sort of baseline where you can pick up people from.
Right. And transitioning to the next question. So, going back to the whole job thing, you say you do your studio job and then you do freelancing on the side, but you also do personal work, correct?
Yes, I do.
Like, what keeps you motivated and inspired to keep doing that work, even though you're already like technically your artistic job, your studio job, or your freelance stuff is your job? Like, what keeps you constantly motivated?
Well, in a funny way, all the other work keeps me motivated to do my personal work, because it's not often that you're gonna be doing actual work, like your day-to-day work that you do at your job is gonna match up with the things that you as an artist personally are interested in. Mm-hmm. And so the more I sort of work on stuff that I'm just like, man, this is, the subject matter here is really dumb, or like, this is just like a really tacky project, the stuff that they want, because you're making stuff for other people. And so the more you do stuff for other people that you don't really like,
mm-hmm.
at least for me, it sort of fuels my like, oh my god, when I get home, I'm gonna I'm gonna draw this character that I've been thinking of for like the whole day. You know, there's all these ideas that would have been cool if I got to do them at work, but since I don't get to do them at work, let me do it at home. Otherwise, I'm gonna like explode.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I always wondered, like, I follow a few artists who they go to work and they work in AAA studio jobs and they're making like 3D character art all day, and then they come home and then they stream for like 3 hours, and I always wondered, how do you still have that drive? Like, you're constantly pumping out creative energy.
Yeah, I think there are two things. There are two things in that. There's kind of an autopilot that you develop when you've been working somewhere long enough that you can do most of your work at your actual job without sort of taxing yourself heavily mentally. Where it's just kind of like, okay, there are periods of time in a project where you're trying to solve a lot of problems creatively, but then there's a whole bunch of time where it's just the sort of busy work, where it's just like, all right, now we know what this design is. Let me just set about actually making it. And when you're in that sort of period, you kind of go into autopilot. You're just like, all right, this is where I'm trying to get, and then you sort of sit all day and work towards that, and you kind of turn your brain off for a bit while you're doing all that stuff, and then you get home and you're like, all right, turn it back on, actually do the stuff that do some other stuff, do something different, so that I don't get so that it doesn't get stagnant in your head.
Interesting. And so with that, it makes it a lot easier to like balance work and personal life.
Somewhat. There's a degree of sacrifice to it where it's like you can't do everything all the time, so you have to kind of figure out when you're gonna take breaks from stuff and when you're not gonna work on personal stuff quite as much. And everyone has different methods for how they deal with this. I know personally that I like to just sort of do other stuff for a while. Like I just won't draw or paint or anything like that for a good portion of say like the weekends usually or something like that. I play soccer, so I'll go play soccer, hang out with friends, just do things that aren't sort of art related, so that when I actually get back to it, I'm not I never feel jaded or frustrated. Or I mean, I'll feel frustrated every now and then, but not like cripplingly so that I can't actually work on anything. But there will be times when it's like, all right, well, there is this personal project that I really, really want to get going, and I'm not going to go out and do all those other things that I want to do because, I've shifted my focus. So. Right.
Interesting, and that's really good too. Like, actually, that's one thing I really want students to get a good understanding of, like the fact of having life outside of your art and it being okay to not be in front of your computer screen or in front of a canvas 24/7, and to take breaks and do something to make yourself come back fresh to the computer screen or the canvas so that you don't burn out.
Yeah, you do not want to burn out. That's rough. That's actually, I think that's the one thing, and it's really tough to achieve this balance, because even I already said earlier, where it's just like, listen, you just got to work as hard as you can and do all the things. And while that's true, there has to be a balance of like, all right, at certain points, at certain intervals, I'm just gonna step away from the computer and go do other things, because it really is important to have a life outside of sort of whatever artwork you're doing, because we're all people at the end of the day. So, right. And also that's actually a lot of where the inspiration comes from, is the stuff that you do when you're not painting. There was a really great talk I got to see when I was still in school by this guy named Shelley Berg. He was like the dean of the Frost School of Music in Miami, and he kind of he had a really cool analogy of just like, whenever you're working on art, there's sort of two wells that you draw from. There's like a well of technique and then a well of inspiration. Mm-hmm. the well of technique is built up by, all your studies, all your examining of artwork, the analysis, all that, the actual the sort of repetitions of just doing stuff over and over again and analyzing and examining and reading and so on and so forth. But the inspiration stuff is the sort of emotional stuff that comes from just living life, that comes from the everyday stuff, that comes from, listening to music, watching movies, going out, conversations with people, traveling, so on and so forth. That's the other part. And the only way you can make something that's really, really good is if both wells are kind of, deep. They're kind of near the same level where you can say, hey, because when you have too much of one and not enough of the other, then you make stuff that's uninteresting or that just doesn't look good. If you have a ton of inspiration but no technique, then you're just going to make something where someone will be like, that might have been a cool idea, but it doesn't, it looks terrible. But if you have too much technique and no inspiration, then you get stuff that's like, it's visual candy. It basically turns into noise, where it's essentially just like, here's something that's a really nicely rendered but completely uninteresting character or environment or whatever. And even though it's nice that you can make something that looks nice and so on and so forth, that's not really the goal of being a concept artist. You want to make something that's going to actually, one, function and work in whatever setting you're creating it for, but it also has to evoke some kind of, feeling from the people who are interacting with it, whether it's in a movie or a game or whatever.
Right. And that actually is a good transition to the next question I just thought of. Mm-hmm. Concept art. The goal of concept art. How would you define concept art? Because it seems like a lot of people want to be in the concept art industry, but not very few actually know what it is. So if you could give your own definition to concept art, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, basically concept art is creative problem solving. That's, I think, the simplest way to put it. But what your job is generally to take some form or aspect or idea that someone is trying to fit into a larger project, whether it's a movie or a game or a book or whatever it is, and design it in a way that it fits cohesively with everything else and achieves the goal that it's supposed to achieve. Mm-hmm. So, a concept artist's job is going to be, when the game designer is like, hey, you know what, this is going to be a boss battle. This is the boss character. Then the writer comes in and says, yeah, this is all the history of this boss, and this is what's happened to him, and like, this is what's important. I want the player to feel like this when they encounter them. The concept artist then has to take all that, information, and then synthesize it into something that sort of achieves all those goals. Whether it's a technical thing of like, hey, in this engine we can't actually do something that the writer wants it to do. Is there a way that we can hint at it so that the player will still get that feeling from it? And then you sort of design around that and sort of figure out, okay, well, if we give this character, super big wings or whatever, there's all kinds of, you're basically finding solutions for everyone else's problems and try to make something that looks good and functions well while solving all those problems.
I like that. I really like that definition of just being a creative problem solver, because that takes me back to another talk I've heard previously where I think the lead character artist for Studio Insomniac, the people making Spider-Man PS4, he was doing a talk at GDC, and he said that his team, and Insomniac is really well known for having amazing releases. His team are just basically problem solvers who have really good art skills. Like, the problem solving comes first when it comes to what they do.
Yeah. No, and a lot of concept art isn't the images that people see on ArtStation. Mm-hmm. It's some guy drawing on a napkin in like a meeting room when they're like, well, crap, how do we get the main character up to that level if blah 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 blah, go on and talk about all that stuff. But it's it's really just ideation. It's creating a lot of possible solutions and narrowing down to the best ones, and then creating a representation for everyone else in the team to apply your solution. So obviously, if you're working mostly in 2D, a big part of what you do is making it so that the guys on the 3D team actually model whatever it is that you're making, and then also that the people rigging and the people animating have an idea of how it's all going to fit together and move. So it's you're very much like you're involved with pretty much everyone on the team in some way, shape, or form. You know, you kind of, and I I like it just because I feel like you're kind of the creative nexus of the team, where obviously everyone has all sorts of ideas for everything that's going to happen in the game, but ultimately the form those ideas take comes from the concept artist.
Man, really, really interesting. And I remember, because we've spoken before in the past, that you said when it comes to trying to get in the industry, very few people actually know what concept art is. So even though people trying to get into concept art, it may seem very crowded, it's actually not as dense as most people think it is.
Yeah, I would say it's artificially dense in the sense that there are a lot of people applying for the jobs, but a lot of the people aren't actually, they don't really have portfolios that are geared towards the job they're applying for, or they just literally don't know what the requirements are for them as they try to get those jobs. So there's probably a ton of portfolios that get sent in that just get thrown out because it's like, all right, well, there's no actual concept art in this. And so that's while it is one thing that can be a little heartening for people, there's a little possible hope light at the end of the tunnel for people who think it's impossible. But at that same time, even with the competition that's there, it's still tough. You still have to be really good to get in.
Right. It's all about quality. It's like the quality of people who are applying with you, not really the quantity.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's like there are kind of three things that they're going to be looking for. Is one, how good are you just as a baseline? What's your actual fundamental skill level? And then two, what's your experience? If you actually are able to work within their pipeline and their team or whatever it is. And then three, how well your work actually fits with what it is they're trying to do. Because there are a lot of concept artists who are very good, but they're very good for a specific sort of style and or a specific kind of project. And that last one it depends on the studio. So like Blizzard, for example, is somewhere where you're going to have to be able to fit into their style as a, overall, like you really kind of have to fit with their design aesthetic and sort of how they make things look. Similarly with Riot, for example. Riot is another one. Riot has a little bit more variance. Like if you look at Paul Kwan, like he's a bit more stylized. He has much more of a personal style than some of the other people working there, but he still fits within, like, if they needed him to do like a splash illustration, like he will make it look amazing and just fit in with all their stuff. But if you look at some other studios and some other games, I think one of the interesting things most recently was Horizon Zero Dawn. The character designer, I think she goes by Loish.
Yes.
Loish.
Yes, Loish.
Yeah, she has a very like unique style. She has her kind of style that I think everyone kind of knows at this point. She's seen her art everywhere. But when you look at the game and you look at actually a lot of the other concept art that people were making, it's much more sort of standard AAA kind of like, semi-realistic or mostly realistic concept art. But hers is very like in her style. And so there's something to be said for some people. If you're good enough, if your style is unique enough and you just sort of carve out a niche for yourself, you can kind of pick up projects at places that it doesn't seem it would make sense. But again, that's pretty high level stuff. You got to be really good to get there, you know.
Right. Like one person I've interviewed in the past was Becca Halstead, and she has a similar thing of Loish, where she's worked, she's done some things for NetherRealm. Oh, I'm sorry, they've done some things for NetherRealm, but they've also worked as an artist, a texture artist for Blizzard. Two completely different art styles, yet the same artist. Mainly because they have a good range of what they're able to do, but also because their problem solving and their ability as an artist are really, really good.
Yeah. Well, and there's a thing for concept artists in general, depending on kind of where you sit and how you make your work. There are a lot of translatable skills. You know, there are a lot of concept artists who could easily be a character artist within the team. They could be the 3D sort of character artist who actually builds the model. You know, they could do UI stuff. You know, there's a range, just because as you expand, because, you know, obviously you're not just doing characters. There's other stuff that you'll probably have to do as far as props and environments, etc. As you sort of expand your game knowledge, you kind of get a sense of how to do a lot of the other stuff. You may not do it incredibly well, as far as, like, you know, it's not your specific thing, but you can sort of be passable in a number of other different lanes. You know, so like doing textures, for example, would be something that character artists or concept artists might be able to, like, figure out, just because you work with texture all the time and you have a sense of, like, how things are supposed to look. A lot of it draws down to, you know, fundamentals and how good your sort of base knowledge is of just visually making things look good.
Interesting. And on that, with versatility, what do you think of the idea of concept artists learning and incorporating 3D into their pipelines and workflows? Is it something that you think should be an absolute necessity for students trying to go into that field? And where do you think it's most helpful?
Yeah, I don't think it's a necessity, but it's definitely very marketable. It's the kind of thing where if you should do it if you want to, really. That's kind of how I look at it. If you don't really feel the need to do it, then you don't have to. I think it's just a question of, are you able to do that? And you know, if what's going to be your main sort of method of delivery? You know, if you're going to learn 3D, or you probably should get good at it and be able to do it, because one of the things that a lot of people do as concept artists is they'll be good at 2D and develop 2D pretty well, but then they'll have, like, really sort of base level knowledge of 3D, and then try to make things in 3D to pass on to the modelers, and that actually creates problems in a pipeline rather than solves them. Because if you're going to make something in 3D, then it should be there's a level of, like, usability there, where it needs to be, like, something that they can actually just build on right away, and, you know, do at least a little bit of minimal cleanup, maybe do a few iterations of their own, and, like, have something that works. But if the amount of time it takes to make a good 3D character, it needs to be good, because in that same amount of time, if you're working 2D, you could probably make more stuff and go through the ideation a lot more efficiently. So if you're going to learn 3D, be good at 3D. Is essentially what I'm going to say. You know, that's an added. It's, you know, it's not an excuse for your 2D to lessen, because you still need to be able to communicate with 2D. But whatever 3D you pick up, you better be good at it. Otherwise, other people will just be mad at you for not doing things right.
Right. So sometimes it's best to just, if you're not going to pick up 3D and be insanely good at it, it's best to just stick with what you know and just be really good at that. Like, one thing I really remember from the last time we spoke was your quote that the best painters in Naughty Dog can finish a full illustration before people who do extra methods like 3D and photobashing finish their reference.
Oh yeah. I think it was specifically what's his name, Ryan Meinerding was the person I was thinking of. He is somebody, and I got this, I forget who it was who told me, but when he told me, he was just like, yeah, Ryan doesn't do photobash. Like, and I was just like, there's no way he doesn't do photobash. Does he do 3D? He's like, nope. It's all just like 2D. He just paints it. Mm-hmm. And I was absolutely amazed because this guy is doing incredible work for Marvel, for their movies and whatnot. And you look at it and you're just like, the level of fidelity, it looks incredible. But he was just like, yeah, if you just get good enough at doing stuff the regular way, then sometimes you don't need the extra techniques, the sort of photo bashing, and those techniques are meant to save you time rather than improve the quality of the image. And so if you get fast enough, or you work efficiently enough that you can just make whatever it is that you're trying to make without doing a whole bunch of fancy stuff, then just do it that way. Otherwise, there are people who are both really good painters and know their way around photo bashing. So for them, it's just like a cheat code. It just saves them a whole bunch of time in putting stuff together. So like James Pack would be somebody like that, who just like, he's just really good at painting in general. But then if he needs to do something a little quicker, he'll just photo bash, throw some textures on rather than, painting all that stuff in, because people don't necessarily look at the extra, at the whole process. They look at sort of like, hey, this painting from beginning to end took me 2 hours with photo bashing. And then the other guy, they'll be like, that guy, it took him 3 hours. And then it's like, yeah, but you spent 2 hours finding reference and, color balancing and adjusting levels and all this other stuff, all the incidental stuff. So in the production timeline, he spent less time than you. So
wow,
there's you have to start looking at it from that standpoint also.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And that brings me to my next question, which actually has to go back with you. Have you ever felt, well, of course, as an artist, I'm sure you felt discouraged with your artwork before. Like, you've hit a certain point where you feel like your work isn't good enough, and you don't feel like your work is really living up to what work you've seen other people do. How have you gotten through that?
Oh, first of all, I feel like that every other day. But I think there's two ways to kind of look at it. One is that if you listen to a lot of other artists, the people, whoever your heroes are, whoever they may be, whenever they answer this question, the answer is almost uniformly the same across the board, where they're just like, yeah, no, I still get that all the time. Like, I feel like my stuff isn't that, like it's kind of, it's an experience that you never actually get rid of. Like there's always a feeling of like, this isn't as good as it could be, because if you're as you're doing stuff, you're always learning, and you're always sort of reevaluating decisions that you make, because when you're painting something, there's no one correct decision. They're just an infinite amount of decisions, and the ones you pick are the ones you pick. And since you were the one who made it, you have all these alternate routes in your head of how you could have done something differently, and maybe that would have been better. But since you made it the way you made it, you're never gonna find out. So just whatever you make is as long as you feel it's the best you can do currently, then that's all you can ask. Also, nobody starts being the best. You don't begin at I'm a master. You begin not being very good at things. So especially if you're in the sort of really early part of learning how to draw and paint and design and do all these things, you're just not gonna there's gonna be a lot of times where you look at your stuff and you're just like, man, this isn't that good. And sometimes, yeah, that's true, it just isn't that good. But the thing you should take from that is, I have so many more opportunities now after this thing that I finished to make it better next time around.
Wow.
Here are all these things that I could have done better in this one. Damn, I didn't do better, but I can just do another one. And every time I do something and there are wrong decisions made or things that don't look that great, I have the opportunity to do it better. Yeah, and you have an infinite number of tries. That's the beauty of it. You don't ever have to, there's never a point where it's like, man, I'm bad and I'm just gonna be bad for forever. You always, it's a constant state of improvement. And I think it's good every now and then to take a look back at things you did, a year, 2 years, 3 years ago, because that's when you get a sense. You're never gonna, it's very rare that you're gonna look at something that you did and be like, wow, I've gotten a lot better. You're just kind of gonna be sitting there and working on stuff day in and day out and going through it, and then it's like maybe like a year or 2 years later that you look back and you're just like, oh man, that was really bad. Why did I do that way? And then you're looking at your stuff now and you're like, oh, okay, you know what? I've actually gotten better. And you kind of have to see it in that sense. It's a journey of 1,000 steps. Each step comes after the previous one, but you don't really notice the distance until you've made it all the way through.
Man, wow, that's really interesting way to put it. And I like how you said that it's something that everybody goes through, because I believe it was 2 years ago, our school VCU had Jamie Jones as a live guest artist, and he was doing a live painting for the students, and he was answering questions, and I happened to ask, did he ever feel like he went through imposter syndrome? And
he was like, I'm still going through it.
Yeah, those were his exact words. Like, he's still going through it, and he's Jamie Jones, a god in most people's eyes,
Yep. No, and that is I think it's just a natural thing that happens if you're somebody who's an artist, if you're creative. I think it's there are a number of reasons for it, I think, but mostly I think it's the fear of becoming conceited. And sort of when there's too much confidence in your work, there's a feeling that like, if I feel this good about the work, then something must be off. If I don't know, like something's not right. Like you get really used to sort of struggling through work and always feeling like there's something you can improve. And if you get to a point of making something and you feel like there's literally nothing about it that could be better, then what's the point in continuing being an artist? Like if you feel like you've made something that is the peak of anything you could ever make, then what's the point in doing anything beyond that?
That's true.
Yeah. And so that's why I think partially that's like a subconscious thing about like, like, man, there's something that can be improved. There's got to be something that's better. And it all comes from the process of actually making the art itself. The reason why we can look at other people's work and be like, man, that's perfect. That's such a great whatever it is. This is so good. Like, is because we're not involved in the process of making it. We're not making every single decision here and there. We're just kind of like sitting back and seeing the outcome and thinking like, man, that's actually the perfect series of strokes in order to make that character look the way they do. But that's because we only have one version of that story.
Right.
Yeah.
Man, that's awesome. It's so cool. Over to the next question would be, for your personal work, these go into your personal workflow. What resources do you use when you do studies?
Man, I don't do studies as much as I should, but usually what I'll do is it actually varies a bit. Most recently, I've just been sort of looking at a number of the artists that I really like, who just have really different styles from me, and just doing copies and seeing if I can figure out sort of their structure of stuff, the way their habits when they tend to draw things certain ways or paint things in certain ways, and just see if I can break that sort of stuff down and then recreate it doing something else, so I can get a better understanding of just like shortcuts in when I'm painting things, because all the technique is really, a lot of it is just a series of shortcuts. Speed is how you build speed, is actually getting those shortcuts. So I can only do characters as quickly as I can using the shortcuts I've learned previously, that allow me to cut down on a lot of redrawing lines and redoing strokes, trying to get it just right. So that's something I've been doing most recently, and that's just literally just Google search and looking at a bunch of images. I have a big old reference folder with a bunch of art that's all inspiration. So I do that, and then I'll do just portraits and now and then of just whatever person. I've started doing more celebrities because there's a thing about doing portraits. It's easier to do portraits of people whose faces you're not sort of familiar with. If you're just sort of picking somebody at random and just doing a portrait, that's easy to do, or easier to do. But when you're doing somebody or somebody whose face you've seen a whole lot, your mind starts to mess with you a bit, because the way you memorize people's faces actually it distorts them. It actually characterizes them a little bit. And so when you draw someone's face from memory versus looking at a photo, you find that they don't look, a lot of things, you exaggerate things in ways that you didn't think you would. And it's fun to sort of play around with those subconscious things that your brain does.
Oh my gosh, wow, I've never once thought of that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a really cool thing, and so that's the kind of thing that I picked up from one of my old sort of teachers, and he was a sculptor, and he was really good at those sort of little bits of knowledge about, like, hey, when you draw people, you tend to draw them from eye level down, and so perspective dictates that especially if you're drawing them in person, you're going to draw their legs smaller than they actually are, and their hands larger than they actually are. And that's just like a default thing that a lot of people do. And it also happens with sculptors, where when people are learning how to sculpt early on, they mess with proportions in so many weird ways, because they're used to seeing people from very specific perspectives. And so their gauge of the actual size of different parts of the body isn't accurate.
Wow.
Stuff plays out.
The interesting things you can pick up from talking to professors.
Yeah, no. So when I do studies, I try to look for stuff like that. Those are those little those nuggets are the kind of, I think those are the things that make a big difference. Once you sort of get your fundamentals down of just like form and line and composition and so on and so forth, the stuff that gives your work its unique flavor is the sort of little bits of knowledge that you accrue and how they take shape in sort of how you actually make stuff, how you render stuff. So people will have stuff that is kind of unique to them, that is like I know at least one thing that people cite a lot for me is they're always like, man, you always do faces in a really cool way, or like you do really evocative eyes. And that's and I sort of went back and I was like, why is that? I draw a whole bunch of stuff. Why is it that these are the things that capture people? And I was like, oh, it's because I have a really specific way that I tend to draw and render eyes that I picked up at some point. I forget, from some study of somebody, and it's kind of persisted.
Yeah, seeing your work and how like well rendered it is, and the paintings it has a really painterly style, and your humans, like the more you go up recent work, the more you correct you see the anatomy and the proportions. So that's really interesting how those ways of using those resources you can actually see how they've gone into your work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and this brings me to my next question, which is, are there any places that you go to specifically when you're running low on ideas?
I don't know that I haven't necessarily had that particular problem in a while, just because I have a whole bunch of stuff on the back burner. I have a lot of work in progress, working files and folders. I mean, Pinterest, really. Just kind of hop on Pinterest and just be like, what shows up? I tend to do that. Also, I guess I just watch a lot of movies. I watch a lot of movies and TV when I'm feeling like that, just because I think there are a lot of cool ideas that exist sort of as one-offs in different shows, different TV shows and movies that you don't really see anywhere else. And it's cool every now and then you see something, you're like, man, that's a really cool concept. Like, why doesn't anyone do that with anything else? It's the same deal. I also read, not read so much, audiobooks in various genres. Every now and then people describe something and it's just like, oh, okay. You hear the description and it might be something you've never heard of before. And so when you try to make it yourself, even though it's something that other artists may have tackled already, just because you haven't necessarily seen their versions of it, you might have an opportunity for coming up with a cool way to represent something. So that's another thing to do.
Cool. I like your take on that, because I think I heard this one quote quite a long time ago that said, when it comes to concepting and creating ideas, everything's already kind of been done, but each person's different interpretation on how they want to do something that's already been done is what creates technically quote unquote originality.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the stuff is just when you're designing something, it's hard to, you can't really make something new up out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. I like to think of it like language. It's like slang words don't really, they don't just get made up, so to speak. They sort of arise kind of out of nowhere. Like they kind of arise from things that already exist, where somebody says or does something and then it catches on, and then the idea sort of synthesizes from a bunch of different things and becomes a word eventually. But it's not something that someone is sitting somewhere and is like, I'm going to decide to call this thing this. It's kind of like a practice that catches on over time. And so it's the same thing with ideas. When you're generating a character or something like that, you kind of use a shorthand of already existing ideas to make whatever it is that you're trying to make. Whether it's like using already existent characters or something like that, where like if you think about Assassin's Creed, where it's just like, Middle Eastern ninja, that's kind of what Altair is in the first game. And so it's like you take established tropes and combine them in ways that they haven't been combined before. And so the better you get at it, the more complex those combinations can be.
Understood. Definitely a good idea. Definitely gotta keep that one noted for those who are running low on ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually the easiest way to relieve this sort of pressure in your head when you're trying to design a new character, where it's just like, just give yourself just like a sentence of just like, this is a I don't know, a South American ninja who wields magic or something like that, and you just kind of then pick up a bunch of reference and be like, oh, how can I put these things together? Like, what is there anything that's similar to this, so on and so forth, and do stuff that way.
Really cool idea. Okay, moving on to the next question. Lots of students within college feel like it's very common for students to feel behind. Some students can feel behind their peers in terms of artistic development. Like some students haven't grown as much, or some students haven't. They see a student like shining above the rest, and they can feel like they're not. They can see that they're nowhere near their level, and they can have insecurities because of that.
Yeah.
Have you got to this yourself while you were in school, and what do you best recommend to tackle that?
I didn't go through it so much in school, just because I didn't really, just because of the nature of my school and what most people were doing. I didn't really have other people who were doing similar stuff to me, and so it just kind of, I didn't really look at most of the other people's work. I actually just didn't pay attention for the most part to a lot of other people's work. But I think one thing to say to yourself and actually be very aware of is that progress isn't linear. And so just because right now you feel like maybe someone's art is better than yours doesn't mean, one, that it'll always be better, but two, it isn't really important for your work how good someone else is. You know, it's not it's not actually helpful to frame things in that way. One way to look at it is to think, hey, you know what, here's somebody who has, you know, maybe I feel like is ahead of me or whatever, and has all this stuff that they've figured out. Maybe I can learn something from them. You know, you shouldn't. You should use that always as an opportunity to learn and get better yourself, because, you know, that's actually one of the best ways to improve, is to surround yourself with people who you think are better or, you know, near your skill level.
I get it. If you can't really beat them, join them.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, is it's not really it's not really a competition, really, in the sense of like, I mean, obviously in the job market it's a competition, but there generally is enough work for everybody, and the more healthy way to look at it is sort of a friendly rivalry, where it's just like, hey, here's this person who's really good, but, you know, I want to learn from them, and maybe they'll have stuff that they want to learn from me. You know, there's an interesting thing I think that happens a lot of times when people encounter somebody that they think is really good, and they're like, hey man, how do you do blank, 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 and blank? And then every now and then they'll find out that person really likes their work, and they're like, hey, I really like when you do so on and so forth. So I think you shouldn't make it necessarily adversarial. Like, it should be more of like let's learn together and figure this stuff out. You know, maybe you can soak up some of their good habits, they can soak up some of yours, and overall that just makes everything better for everyone else. I mean, it's like when people ask why, if it's so competitive, would current working artists be going to students and giving them all their secrets? You know, it's like,
that's true.
Yeah, because if everyone's better, everyone's better.
I love that outlook. It makes it seem like less of a brawl and less competitive, because that's one thing I guess that's either an artist or student nature. Like, we just get really competitive, so we think, okay, who's the best? How can I get to the top? How can I beat this person?
Yeah. Also, yeah. I think there's I definitely did see that when I was in school, but I wasn't really a part of it because it didn't seem particularly fruitful to me. Like, I didn't see what the benefit of it would be. You know, like, I get every now and then there are things like at gallery when they do like juried shows, and like winners can get like some money or something like that. Like, that stuff, cool. That's some stuff that people can get. But I think people should have a more long-term outlook on that, because in college sure, it seems like this is the center of everything, and this is where the competition truly is. And if I don't succeed here, and if I'm not the best here, then I'm not going to make it anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think people should look at it that way. You should really just focus on improving and trying to get yourself, where you need to be. Because I know, for example, I don't know that I ever even got stuff entered into a show. I don't know. But I didn't do that well on my senior show. But I was maybe like one of 10 people who like just had a job right after graduating.
Wow.
So it's not, it's a question of like, what's really important to you? Are you an artist because you want to be better than that guy, or are you an artist because you want to make good art? I think that's a important question to ask.
I absolutely love that question and love that answer. Like, answering that question with that question should be the best way of tackling that problem.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, absolutely. And if you are an artist just because you want to be better than that guy, then good luck, because there is always going to be someone better than you.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's
so
true.
Good luck.
If people like Jamie Jones, and please look up Jamie Jones's work if you don't know what his stuff is already. If people like him can have imposter syndrome, and your goal is to be like the best, that seems like running up an endless escalator.
Yeah, it's just not healthy. Like, you're just gonna burn yourself out and just be emotionally exhausted very, very early on. Just focus on the art. That's the best I can tell you.
Right. Okay, bringing me to my next question, which I'm really interested in. The last time we spoke, you mentioned that you had some pretty high up connections within the concept art industry. You knew people like Anthony Jones or Mark O'Neller, or I can't really remember many of the other ones, but you have some pretty good connections. How exactly did you go about that, and how would you recommend students to get connections like that themselves?
Yeah, so basically, for me, it comes mostly from when I was... Actually, maybe not. I mean, a good amount of it is from... I was active on the conceptart.org forum, mm-hmm. which kind of had a golden age sort of at the right time for me, because at that time, it was a lot of working industry professionals who were very active on the forums. And so when I was really just starting out, I was, just doing terrible drawings here and there, and posting stuff up and doing my best to do life drawing and all that stuff. I was getting feedback from people who eventually, I'd see them be like, oh my God, that guy worked on God of War, like that sort of thing, where it's like, I remember that guy, he commented on this one thing that I made. And then eventually, just because of they'd seen my work enough in the early days, that sort of later on in time, where they saw where my work is now, they're like, hey, I remember you from back when you were on concept art. And I was just like, yeah, awesome. And so they're just like, yeah, you've gotten a lot better. And then you just sort of get into conversations about all sorts of random stuff like wrestling or weightlifting and stuff like that. And so because the relationship started from a point of there not being any expectations of like, hey, can you get me an internship, or that sort of thing, they just sort of develop a lot more naturally. There are a few people who are just, they're just more personable in general, like Anthony Jones, AJ. He's really he just likes talking to people a lot more. And I had taken a course with him, and basically throughout the course, he had a lot of really good advice, and sort of we kept in touch. And then I was active on his robot pencil community, and eventually became a mod there, and just sort of keep talking with people there, and to the point where it was just in constant contact with him. I kind of met some other people, and just kept talking in that sense. And then there are a few others. Like there's one guy, Carlo Arlano. He's an art director at Super Evil Megacorp, and he's somebody that I think he just saw a bunch of my work and was just kind of like, hey, you know, there's this. I like your work, but there's just like this one thing that you should really work on that I think will take your work to the next level. And you know, because of that, I started talking to him a bit more and sort of, you know, talk about all kinds of stuff, and you know, eventually took a course with him, and a lot more of the same sort of situation of learning, because there are a lot of people who I think if they see some sort of spark, if they see something that they like in your work, they'll reach out and just say something. But another way is just sort of, you know, send a message every now and then, say hi. If you generally, I would say keep it short. You know, maybe you have some specific question about something, but definitely don't badger people. But just kind of say, hey, what's up? You know, if they have time and whatever it is that you're asking about or what you end up talking about is interesting, then the conversation might continue beyond that, and then eventually, I think what happens is the industry is kind of a small community in the sense that a lot of people have worked with each other at different points in time, and so you sort of get into different circles. And if your work reaches a certain level, then and enough people know you and about you, then you kind of have a scenario where people know about you or know of you before you kind of actually meet and talk, and so that helps somewhat in the sense that, like, hey, oh yeah, I remember I saw your work on whatever. And so I think there's a whole number of ways to do it, but generally just, you know, say hi, maybe ask a question or two, and if nothing comes of it, then nothing comes of it. Just, you know, sort of continue on with your day, and whenever you get the opportunity to speak to somebody, just, you know, you can just kind of do it. I hear conventions are a big place for this to actually happen. You know, go to a convention and say hi, you know, the artist that you like, and treat it like you would meeting any other person, and that's, you know, your best bet. There's I think so conceptart.org, which is where a lot of people met, one of the sort of big places that everyone met initially was they had big workshops for Massive Black, which is the concept art company that was tied to the website. And they recently announced another Massive Black workshop, so that would be a place to go, because if there's anything approaching what it was sort of around the first few, there will be a lot of really well-known and really, really talented artists there, and just generally good vibes. Just people, a lot of people who met over the interwebs and are now all friendly. Yeah.
So I guess in the end, constant activity online, reaching out to people, and also just remembering that even though they're these huge, like, massive industry level connections, they're just people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's I would say definitely always put your work out, you know, keep working and you know, put stuff out. But the you know, never badger people, I guess, is the thing. You know, send your message. They either respond or they don't respond. You know, don't take it personal, because people get busy. Right. And also, you at some point have to understand that you are also a stranger if they don't actually know you, and so they might not always respond. But just generally be a decent person. Say hi. Do those things. If you go to a convention, say hi. Don't linger too much, but, you know, hang around.
Right.
Yeah. I wouldn't know conventions so much, though. I've actually never been. I'm doing my first convention ever this year. So I'm going to be at WakandaCon with with Anthony Jones and Marco and a bunch of other people.
Oh, when and where is that?
Yeah, that's actually, I think it's August 2nd through the 5th in Chicago. Yeah, I think I'm doing a panel on the second day with Anthony and Marco and a few others.
Cool. If you're watching this video before that, make sure to go there.
Oh, yeah. Dude.
Okay.
Approach me like an ursine mammal.
Yes. Remember everything he just said, and then approach Thabiso, please. Okay, and this brings me to my final question of the night. What are your current goals / aspirations that you are reaching for?
Cool, yeah. So right now I have a whole bunch of side projects sitting sitting in a folder, and also some actually next to me. I started a book. I actually did it for my senior thesis. That was all sort of Afrofuturist / Afropunk designs, where I was sort of developing my own IP, and I'd written a story for it, and I kind of wanted to try my hand at designing a full universe, or as much of it as I could. And sort of draw most of the inspiration from, African mythology, African design, and that sort of stuff, because I am African. But at the time, I wasn't really equipped to do it. And so more recently, I've started to pick that project back up and give it the treatment it actually needs to continue. So at some point, I'll probably put it out in sort of book form. So I'm continuing on that, and there are just a few other things that I'm working on as pitches for potential either graphic novels, or eventually I kind of want to get into film, or whether it's live action or animated. So been learning to do some screenwriting and stuff like that. So working on that. Otherwise, just continuing building up my portfolios, maybe making a move at some time in the near future to a gaming studio. Doing that. I want to do my first Magic card sometime soon. So that might be in the works soon. So I don't know. Look out for the look out for my stuff. I hope it's unique enough that people kind of recognize it. So that'll be the test.
I say your style's definitely unique. So I hope so too. And anything that you put out, I'll be definitely following you and announce it to the Facebook page or whatever, so people in the club will absolutely know when you release anything.
Oh, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
No problem. Okay. And with that, that's the last question of the night. Thank you so much, Thabiso, for just this endless waterfall of knowledge that you've given in the last, how long? Hour and 30 minutes.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it had been that long. All right. Yeah, no problem, man. Anytime.
Yeah. If you want to follow Thabiso, you can click on the links in the video right over there. Make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, because we're going to be trying to do a lot more of these videos coming a lot more consistently. Can't promise when, but they're coming. And with that, any final closing remarks, Thabiso? Anything you want to say to the world, or the small club?
Yeah, no, actually, I wanted to say your club is lucky to have you, because I don't think there are a lot of places where there are people trying to create a space to gather useful knowledge for, people trying to enter the industry. So I keep it up.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, and with that, Thabiso, I want to give you a good night, and hope you best of luck with everything that you're doing.
All right, man. Good night.
All right, take care. Goodbye.